Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second panel of today's Qatar Creates Public Panels. And it is my pleasure to welcome our panelists, and our moderator, Dr. Julia Gonnella, will present the panel and the topic.
Yes, hello, good evening, and first of all, thank you for staying. We are very happy to be here, and we are very happy to see so many of you, absolutely delighted. And this is how I'd like to welcome you today to the second panel of Qatar Creates, with the title Orientalism, a view from the East. And for this, we have gathered this distinguished group of curators and scholars, cultural experts, to find out whether we can find out, some interesting counter-narrative and some critical analysis of Oriental art. Maybe for those who are not from Qatar, from outside, you might want to know that Qatar actually holds an extremely significant collection of Orientalist art worldwide. Art, paintings, some sculpture, photography, huge photography collection is really very famous. And one of the reasons we're holding this lecture tonight, this panel tonight, is because we got the green light for the new museum, right? Which has been planned for many, many years. And it's a piece of architecture by the Swiss company, Swiss architects Herzog de Meuron, HDM. And it's an amazing building, actually. It's very big, 5 floors. And what is so interesting, it's not considered as a pure art gallery, but the idea is to include a think tank for people to talk about Orientalism, Oriental art, and also have a theater, plays, audience, like an auditorium. It's very large. Maha Island is in Lusail, also for those people who are not from Qatar. It's towards the north of Qatar, and Maha Island is this island which now houses Winter Wonderland. So you can go with your children, you can put the children in Winter Wonderland and then come to us to the museum. So it's very nice. So also for those who are students or don't know, I mean, just to briefly delineate Orientalist art. Orientalist art is that's a good question, and we are going to discuss this. But from Wikipedia sort of perspective, one would say it's like paintings or art from Western perspective, Europeans, mainly 19th century, but also 18th century, and people start even earlier on. I mean, those people here from MIA, they know there is exchange between East and West from the beginnings of the Prophet and before. This is what it is. And of course, it depicts, I don't know, the city of Cairo. It depicts ladies in the harem. It depicts camels and horses. And, they will tell you more about this. And of course, it's all part of a bigger Orientalist discussion, which is now, part of post-colonial studies, and people look at it very critically. So for sure, the Orientalist Museum, which is now called the Lusail Museum, is not going to be just a simple art gallery where we put and hang the paintings, but we will need to start a narrative. And that's part of our today's evening is, what sort of narrative can we talk about? What sort of questions can we ask to these paintings? And, how do we make it relevant for today? Just also last thing, I also would like to announce, it's already announced, but I'd like to mention that the Lusail Museum, together with Mataf, and Zena is here as well, the director of Mataf Museum, are going to host an exhibition this fall on the French painter, Orientalist painter Gérôme. It's in 3 parts, and one of the curators is sitting with us on the panel. So I'd like to introduce now our distinguished guests, and I start with Dr. Nadia, or Professor Nadia, from the University of Bern, who is teaching in Bern World History. She is probably post-colonial studies, and her research focuses on transnational and global histories of the avant-garde, modern and contemporary art from the Middle East and its diasporas, Orientalism, decolonization in the museum, and she wrote a very important book on the modern art of Egypt. She's half Egyptian, half Swiss, and she studied Arabic language and civilization and literature. I think probably what you would have called before Orientalism, and art historian. She's an art historian, and she's currently working on her habilitation that only exists in German-speaking countries. Then I'd like to continue with Sara Raza, who is one of the curators of the Jerome exhibition. In fact, she's curating several exhibitions at the same time. She has to go back to Dubai tonight because she's opening an exhibition on Mandi Al Sayr in the Lauri Shabibi gallery. She's an award-winning curator, writer, and she's author of Punk Orientalism, and we want to hear about what is Punk Orientalism, the art of rebellion. She curated in New York, in the Salomon Guggenheim Museum, in Milan, the Rubin Museum of Art in New York, in Mataf, the Tashkent Biennale, the Venice Biennale, and many more. And she was formerly at the Guggenheim Museum, curator for the Middle East and North Africa. And she holds a BA in English literature and the history of art, and an MA in 20th century art history and theory from the Goldsmiths College in London. Then we finally have Kholood. Kholood Al-Fahad is a very well-known figure in Qatar museums, obviously. She's the deputy director of collections of the Lusail Museum, and she joined Lusail Museum 2011, so she's seen the museum from its inception. She knows the collection very well, and she started as a research assistant, became curator of fashion, and then anyway, so she really has been working a lot. She's one of the drivers of this museum, so I'm very happy she's on board today. She did a BA in also English literature. This seems to be a starting point with Orientalism, and then also did an MA on museology here at UCL in Qatar. So please welcome the three ladies and. I think we start, and I would like to start with Nadia, Dr. Nadia. How did you become interested in Oriental art? What do you think is so fascinating about Oriental art? And why do you think it's relevant?
Thank you, Julia, also for the introduction. So, I mean, on a very personal level, as you mentioned, I'm Swiss Egyptian, so I guess I'm a direct product of the encounter between East and West. But as an art historian, I became interested in Orientalism because I wanted to understand what those artworks told us about the social, cultural, political context in which they were made, and also to understand the very long-lasting effect of those images up to today on our sort of visual culture and the image maybe that the Middle East has, or the way the Middle East is represented in the West.
And how do you see the production of Orientalist art within the wider discourse? I mean,
well, I mean, of course, we have the notion of Orientalism defined by Edward Said. And I guess Orientalist art echoes Edward Said's definition in the sense that it is the product of a huge body of knowledge that includes all disciplines, literature, and so on, produced by the West, scientific approaches, but it's also a total fantasy. So in that sense, it echoes Said's definition, but I also think that Orientalist art can broaden really the narrative or the discourse on Orientalism. I think it can make us think beyond the binary East-West, probably make us also think beyond the fact that they are solely products of Western domination in a colonial context. I think that Orientalist painting, for instance, is full of contradictions, full of ambiguities, and that if we embrace those contradictions, that's when it becomes really interesting and fascinating. And I believe that when such objects travel and find themselves in other spaces, other geographies, such as here in Qatar, they have then other meanings, produce other meanings, have other value, and address different audiences.
Another question for her is of course one of the things which for me is still difficult to grasp, that these Orientalist painters, many of them, of course they traveled and they painted Cairo or Damascus or so, but they also traveled to south of France and they painted the sheep in the Provence, or they went to England. You see, so is there a proper group like Orientalist art?
Yeah, because I mean, of course they also painted the south of France, and the south of France could also be the other for a painter presenting in the Salon in Paris. But I think that the travel to the so-called Orient for those painters first was an exciting endeavor. It was far away, it was different. They discovered new, let's say, new light, new colors. This is very important for those artists. And that's a light that you don't necessarily have in the south of France. You do, but it's the light really when a lot of those painters, Delacroix and so on, they mention in the impact of light and colors. But in any case, they had the requirements then coming back to Paris and presenting the image that was expected of the Orient. And so they had to, in a sense, negotiate what they saw, presenting an image of so-called authenticity or ethnographic truth, which was also let's say, imbued with imaginary.
So it differs to the tourist from today when he takes pictures when he goes to Bali, for example.
I would say so. I mean, a painter is a painter who travels. You have a traveler who paints and a painter who travels. Those were
the people today also, they go, well, it's faster. Like life in general is faster, of course, today than before. But you also take these pictures and, stereotypes a little bit. I mean, I always take the sort of cultural highlights and never look at the traffic jam.
I mean, they were grand tourists, and they did have an image of the Orient before they even traveled, what was to be expected coming to those countries. And very often, actually, they were very disappointed with what they saw, and with sometimes cities that were being modernized, Cairo, Istanbul, and that's not what they were searching for.
Kholood, you worked with the Qatar Museum since the beginnings, and the iterations changed so much, right? Maybe you could talk a bit about this, like how it changed from a pure display of Orientalist art and how the museum expanded, how the concept expanded.
Of course. First, as is when I joined the museum in 2011, mainly the collection was paintings, and works of paper, photography, which were mainly like Orientalist art. That what I mean about Orientalism here, like Orientalist art is the works of art of Western artists depicting the East, and because we don't have a museum, so the way that we promoted for our collection was through the exhibitions, the conferences, and all of these events. And during that period, we were like trying to find out what would be what's the reaction of the people, looking into Orientalist artworks. And because such works, are a little bit debatable, and they are very controversial. So we were thinking, a new thinking, was introduced to the museum. Qatar Museums has a great collection with various works of art, various artists from not only the West, but also from the region. And they respond better, into a new concept that instead of having a very classic museum of, Orientalist artworks, which are specific for a certain type of, or certain period of time, which is 19th century mainly. Why don't we do a new museum, with a new vision that's very, relevant to today, to the issues of, the East, and confrontation with the West, today. And here, a new philosophy came into the museum. So, and instead of having only one-sided museum, one-sided vision, of the collection, only from a Western perspective, we have, something like a double-sided, so how we can reverse that gaze, and bring in the voice of the people from the East into the museum. So that was, how we moved from the Orientalist Museum into more of a Lusail Museum with a broader concept, with a more, a new philosophy, so it's not a very classic, museum, which detects, on people and the audience, certain type of thinking, but it's more of a museum and a think tank, as you said, and introduced the museum at the beginning, a research center. People come together here from all parts of the world and with different backgrounds, with different education experiences, put together, try to interpret these works of art, and bring a new thinking about it, because in Orientalism, it's all about an interpretation. So, and interpretation is the thing that, really, it's what moves the attitudes of the people, towards each other, and it frames the look, the perception of the people. So why don't we say a new story from this part of the world, with a new perspective, a new interpretation, bringing together, as I said, different perspectives, different, experiences, and have a new interpretation of the works.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this is a good move to Sara, of course, as you are a curator for contemporary art, and you look at the Orientalist art from a different perspective, right? And you work with a lot of artists who actually answer on our Orientalist art, which I have to say I wasn't aware of before. That, why would these artists be interested in Orientalist art? Where do they come from? So maybe you could just explain how you got interested in this topic and why you think it's relevant. And then you also have to speak about punk Orientalism, of course, because that's something, I'm really interested to know.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for being here. And Julia, thank you for this very kind invitation. It's a pleasure to join you all. Well, it's very interesting. You mentioned earlier my education was at Goldsmiths College, and Goldsmiths is an art school. It has a very specific trajectory of teaching. It's very much rooted in the post-colonial. But for me, what was sort of really relevant in my own research in Orientalism was looking not just Orientalism proper, how we identify it within the context of Edward Said as an East-West relationship, but rather one that expanded upon that and looked at East-East relationship. I mean, with the work that I'm doing on the Jerome exhibition, it's sort of very evident as the only contemporary curator to be looking not just at Orientalism, but also negritude. It's Orientalism's relationship to negritude, particularly the Francophone, sort of writers, artists, and so forth, but also exploring Soviet Orientalism, a sort of another strand into this relationship to complicate it even a little bit further. So just in terms of thinking about these artist-led trajectories, it is really sort of evident for me, I mean, in terms of the research that I'm doing. You mentioned the book, Punk Orientalism, is to sort of combine disparate ideas, bricolage, if you like. Bricolage is the sort of concept of taking different ideas to join them together to create entirely new meaning. It's not necessarily creating something out of nowhere. It is sort of thinking through very much the way in which Orientalist painters were creating this vision, this so-called vision of the Orient. It took from different time periods, different geographies, different spatial constructs, and created these images, these very fantastical, beautiful images, impeccable images, but yet they were constructs. They were not sort of ever to be seen as a definitive truth. They gave an alternative truth, so to speak, right? So when I was sort of bringing together my own research in this idea of punk Orientalism, well, firstly, the book is a curatorial monograph. It brings together 15 years of my work working in Central Asia, Caucasus, and the Middle East, and also its international diaspora back in Europe and the United States, mixing geographies, mixing ideas, mixing different concepts, not just looking at the post-colonial, but also the post-Soviet, sort of very important moments. I mean, I'm born in 1979, and sort of the legacy of the punk movement in Great Britain is sort of always present. Most of the sort of punk musicians were artists. A lot of those movements came from art schools in London, not just London, but also Leeds, Manchester, other cities in the United Kingdom. And it was sort of very much rooted and embedded within the YBA phenomena, the young British artists in the 90s, but also the new contemporaries that came after that. But 79 was also sort of a very monumental year for people from the Middle East. It was the year of the Iranian Revolution. It was the year of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And it was also the year of a lesser-known incident, I mean, perhaps lesser spoken about, which was the incident of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So these three events, these sort of interruptions that happened, sort of affected everybody who is from that part of the world in one way or another. We were sort of touched by that. And I'm that generation. I was born in England to Iranian and Central Asian parents. So it was sort of very monumental. And then other sort of interruptions happened along the way, 89, 1991, 2001, for example. So I'm very much interested in this idea of rupture and where artists come in to sort of help us understand that historical moment, or rather these cultural interruptions. And I think that that's where the nonconformist punk comes about. The idea of thinking about punk, not just within its British sort of or European legacy, but globally. What were artists doing in the former Soviet Union? What were artists doing in Iran? What were artists doing in the Arab world? How were they sort of responding to their notion of cultural interruption? And then reframing and rethinking Orientalism. Of course, I'm from the school of thought that we're looking at these ideas from a decolonial perspective. We are sort of analyzing from a 20th and 21st century perspective. And it's not just Edward Said, it's also Linda Nochlin and others who have approached this sort of question. But my real interest is how do we sort of dispel this idea of East and West, and sort of even remove the conversation beyond the geography and start thinking about one that's happening east-east. I mean, look at all the advancements that you just mentioned regarding the museum, Kholood, how much sort of activity is happening here. For me, this sort of echoes what was happening in Iran in the 60s and 70s under the Pahlavi. You can sort of see the similar sort of patterns happening culturally and so forth, and new forms of sort of dialogue emerging where visual culture is at the center. Art is at the center of this conversation. Orientalism isn't just obviously visually a cultural movement. It was also, as you mentioned, literature. It was also music. It also moved in different ways. And it migrated into different parts of the world as well.
Yeah, and what was because we just talked about this beforehand, which I thought was very interesting, when you were talking about Orientalism in America, so different to Europe, that there is this, which I'm not so aware, because Orientalism, I mentioned that, Orientalist art is in Europe, from my understanding, it doesn't play a major role, but you said it does in the States. So again, there is also difference between the different areas. So West is not West. Right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting because Jerome in particular, the largest consumer of Jerome's work is the United States. I was really shocked myself to sort of learn this because I'm not a 19th century scholar, I'm a contemporary art historian. My work is rooted in 20th and 21st century, but to sort of think about the institutions like the Clark, the Met, and others, and even the Museum of Fine Art of Houston, that the first painting they ever acquired was a Jerome, that there was this fascination with the Orient, with the Middle East. I mean, America is a very new country, as we sort of recognize, and its relationship is very different to Europe and the MENA and the Middle East and the Orient region, simply because, you know, there's been a reciprocal exchange for many, many hundreds of years between Europe and the Middle East. But however, America's relationship, as we all know, has been one of an imperial intervention and then obviously a military intervention as part of its sort of neo-colonial adventures, if you like. And so the fact that these images are populated within American museum collections, how they enter the imagination, they enter the popular imagination, how they enter visual cultural imagination, populate themselves within media, and then create other kinds of circulation of images and so forth, which is what Edward Said, as we were discussing, Nadia, earlier, what Edward Said was writing about in Orientalism, but also his latter books as well, like Covering Islam as well, how the media made so many mistakes because they were not knowledgeable enough about the different, you know, Middle East isn't a monologue. You know, it's not a monolith at all. It's sort of not one dialogue in itself. It's a sort of multitude of voices, multitude of ethnicities, different spatial topographies, different cultural topographies. And that was sort of really essential that the Orientalists would mix all of this. So when they're creating these fantastical images, they are sort of a bricolage in themselves. They are a little bit like these jigsaw puzzles that don't quite fit, but yet they're beautiful. Their veneer, their facade is stunningly beautiful, yet there is something not quite correct about the way they're constructed. You'll see different time periods. You'll see Mamluk, Ottoman, sort of playing together, and people will misinterpret these images as stereotypical images of Arabs, when in fact we know those images were of the Ottoman period. So, you know, there are all these sort of disjointed elements that then have entered the discourse of visual culture, particularly popular visual culture.
Wow, a lot to do. Kholood. So what do we do now with the Lusail Museum? Which possibilities do we have?
Well, Sara has already said, okay, it's very interesting, okay, because when she explained, okay, how those works of art, okay, are seen differently in the United States, for example, from Europe, okay, this is exactly why, for example, okay, Edward Said, his concept of Orientalism came from, okay, from the environment around him. And this is why I always say, like, you know, works of art are very free space, and they are like the soft power that those, okay, powers are used, okay, in order to enforce their image, okay, the image they want to impose on people. And this is okay, this is okay also where it comes, okay, the new role of the museum, okay, because Qatar Museums, like, you know, has opened the museums, okay, in phases. So our museum is like the last phase where Qatar Museums, okay, is trying to move towards Qatar National Vision 2030, okay, emphasizing the role of Qatar, okay, that it means, okay, in the, like, as a mediator in the conflict in the international cultural scene. So this is something, okay, very important. This is where, okay, we need to use, okay, like art, okay, here as a soft power, okay, in order to correct the images, okay, which are spread, okay, from other kind of powers or, you know, agendas.
Nadia, you want to add on this?
Yes, maybe adding about the museum. I think, I mean, a museum is not a space necessarily where you have to feel comfortable. It's a space that can irritate, where you can be faced with contradictions, with maybe, you know, difficulties. And I mean, that's the challenge, I think, when you have such a collection. But it's also a really great challenge because you can expand the narrative, or the Orientalist discourse, which, you know, as Sara mentioned, is a discourse that was mainly produced by scholars working in the West, also in America, whether Said, Nakhlin, and maybe this is really the opportunity to offer audiences with new narratives that actually are generated by the people, by the societies that were represented in those paintings more than a century ago. So yes, I think you definitely have a big challenge, but it's also a very exciting one. And I would embrace the ambiguities of Orientalism.
But also these works of art, okay, they are not only about the discourse about Orientalism as per se, but we can look at those works of art differently, completely differently. Like as you said before, looking at those works of art, when those artists travel to the East, okay, they've seen the new colors, okay, which is not usual to them, okay, back in Europe. So that affected a lot, okay, maybe the movements, the art movements in Europe. So there is another aspect of influence here and exchange, okay, of the Orient on the Western, okay, artists. So just not only looking at the concept of Orientalism and these, but we have to look at art, okay, also beyond that kind of, like concept and debate.
Sara, and it includes modern art, contemporary art, right?
Well, absolutely, into that conversation, but again, it's coming from a revisionist perspective. Whatever we're doing now is within the time of now. We're looking at, through the art of now, we can sort of readdress some of these issues. I think it's really important. And collections are always going to be a little bit fraught. And, we have to sort of deal with that and create dialogue around that public program and so forth. But I wanted to sort of come back to this idea of this Jerome exhibition, because I'm not the only curator of it. I do have two colleagues also.
One is here.
One is here. Dr. Giles Hudson is here.
Yes.
And also Dr. Emily Weeks, who's based in the United States. And they're both charged with their own respective areas of interest. Giles is looking at photography and Jerome's impact on that and Jerome's use of it, rather. And also Emily is writing the catalogue raisonné of Jerome, so she's creating a more of an academic sort of angle. So when we're working with Zeina Arida, who is the director, also she is here, of Mataf, we're sort of reframing and thinking about this exhibition as a site-responsive, site-specific exhibition happening at an Arab modern and contemporary art museum, which is also very interesting in itself. Why I was sort of drawn to this exhibition, I was very grateful for Zeina for the invitation, was that Mataf is the only museum in the Arab world that is confronting Jerome's legacy and confronting Orientalism. It hasn't happened before. These exhibitions tend to happen, they're happening in the United States, North American landscape, or they're happening in Europe. But for the first time, that's happening here. And that, for me, is very interesting. It's going to open up a lot of questions about inner Orientalism, inner colonialism, inner imperialism, as well as, the historical connotations and the historical sort of legacy of what Orientalism has sort of grappled with over the last 2 centuries. And I think it is very timely also that is happening now, and it is happening at Mataf. And just in terms of the challenges are obvious, that they're the temporal challenges, the spatial challenges, but also the sort of biggest challenge will be obviously how we bring this together for the audience, the next generation, the school children, the university students, and how they are going to sort of help us respond to questions around representation, because that's really at the core of Orientalist work. And the biggest sort of if you like, gripe with it is that these are not representations of people from the so-called Orient or from Africa or even Central Asia, that some of which were depicted. So I think that's sort of very important. How do we sort of readdress that in a way as well? When we're thinking about artist representation, we're thinking about the particular historical moment, we're thinking of now, and how do we deconstruct that without creating a them and us situation, again, an East-West dialectic? How do we sort of respond to this as more of a confluence of ideas rather than creating this, what you called neatly binary?
No, I actually really look forward to. I think it's a fantastic challenge, and there will be so many more conversations. Before I open to the panel, I like one question left is for all of you is why do you think that Orientalist paintings are so cherished, particularly in the Middle East, right? Because I think, the biggest collectors of is Orientalist art are here in Qatar, of course, but in Egypt or in Turkey or in Algeria or I don't know. Nadia.
Good question, huh? I think you can be very much aware of the stereotypes that are conveyed by a painting, an Orientalist painting, and at the same time be very much attracted to it. I think Orientalist painting has something emotional. I mean, Sara could say, but I think a lot of contemporary artists work with this emotion. Could be also a sense of nostalgia. And it's been said, actually, that the fact that so many of the collectors of Orientalist art are in the Arab world is due to misunderstanding or ignorance. I mean, it's been written. And I think that it's the absolute contrary. I think there's a profound understanding of Orientalism in the Middle East more than anywhere. But there is also a will, actually. I mean, one can be attracted by those works. Of course, Jérôme, there is something so attractive. I am attracted by Jérôme's works, and I'm very conscious of the whole discourse behind them. So I think there's a will to also change those narratives. And when works circulate and go from a private collection to a public space or from one space to another, they change. And I think collectors, I mean, it's not misunderstanding, it's not ignorance, it's a will to possess those objects and maybe at the same time to change some narratives.
As Nadia said, when those works, move from one place to another, they change. And I don't know, but one of the collectors, when I talked to, for example, Sheikh Hassan, who established the collection of Orientalist art, he had very interesting reason behind, collecting these. Because I asked him, why did you collect this Orientalist art? So what he said is that Kholood, he believed that there was a circulation of knowledge and, techniques and, there was exchange, in the Mediterranean basin. And he said, at that time, like 19th century and before 16th to the 20th century, people of this region, they were not really interested in documenting what they're doing, this kind of exchange. But the Europeans, they did, document it. So this is why, he believed that documentation is very important, and acquiring these kind of works, is very important also to bring back the history, because as also Sara said, those works, are not like maybe, a painting is, for example, Jérôme's the painting, the blackboard, for example, people maybe in America, Europe or America, they will see it, as a whole scene, which is a real scene. But for us, now we're just, we're like, inviting people to decode, and fragment this kind of painting. Don't look at as a scene, depicting a very passive Orient, but rather, see the architecture, the beautiful architecture, the techniques, used in, like for example, like in the building, and the architecture of the building. Those are documents, that for places and buildings that might not even occur these days. So this is a reference for us to know what was, like how the architecture, how the designs has happened. So this is a documentation, the documentation part of it. But also, I always believe it's very funny. Whenever I tell people that I work in the Orientalist Museum, they get angry, with me, because why do you work with, with people, who said bad things about us or depicted bad scenes about us? But at the same time, people love those kind of paintings and they buy them to put them in their houses. So I always believe, it's because they admire the colors, the vibrant colors. It's the details in those, very photographic details, which really attracts the attention. It's the aesthetic part of those works, which makes them love to have them, which really goes very well with the decoration of the interior designs, here in the East, So it's a mixture of reasons, you know what I mean, and things. And at the same time, it's about us. So we always feel like, we need to buy it because it's about us. So we're, the best people to buy those works. It's more than the others.
Sara, there's something to add here?
Well, I was just going to add something, but it wasn't sort of directly related to what Kholood and Nadia were saying, is that during the 19th century in Iran, during particularly Qatar movement of painting, there was a mimicry of Western styles that were being adopted by Iranian painters for the court. Persian painters who were painting for the royal court would adopt or mimic European. So there was a sort of reversal, Occidentalism, whatever you want to call it, that it wasn't Orientalism, rather, it was a reappropriation of the West and those tropes coming in. But the most important moment of the 20th century in the Arab and Iranian and Turkish art scene was a sort of refusal and rather rejection of some of those tropes, those European tropes, and also the tropes that were sort of installed in the military art academies that were across the Arab world that the Ottomans had established, and to create new languages of abstraction that sort of put a spanner in the works of everything here. It's sort of completely changed the dialogue. So for me, it was always the reversal that I was interested in rather than. But it is a fascinating conversation why Arab collectors are now sort of reclaiming that history, but coming from a country which has very old
Although
history.
I don't think it's now. If I understood it correctly, they started collecting it from the beginning, right? I think from Egypt, I think that they bought it
Well, there were various
in the 19th
bays
century.
that had them, yes, you're right.
They have in Egypt these.
Yeah,
But more now.
Exhibitions, right?
Yeah, collectors from the 19th century onwards were
Now,
already
right?
collecting. Yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking more along some of the contemporary collectors who are very active, Shafiq Gabri and others, who are very actively involved in collecting Orientalism. I was rather referring to more contemporary.
No, I think they were even also before.
And even
19th century.
like in the collection of Qatar, it's a recent activity.
That is recent. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Maybe there are some questions from the audience. There is a lady over there.
Hi, I'm Attica. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Greenwich. I just finished interning at MIA, actually, so I see some familiar faces. And I studied history, and one of the things that I focused on in my degree was Orientalism. And something that, so this question, it's outside the realm of, I guess, museums, but it's still relevant. I grew up in Dubai, and one thing that I noticed in Dubai and also in Qatar is there is, when you go to the souks, there is sort of an image sold, an image painted, which I feel sometimes plays to the Orientalist imagination. So obviously one of the legacies of Orientalist ways of thinking is sort of painting the Orient or the Middle East as though it's all, one thing. There are certain ideas that come to mind, like you think Aladdin, you think, belly dancing. There are certain things that come to mind. Something that I noticed, and I don't know if it's intentional or not, is sometimes you can go to, souks. So I'm thinking of a particular one in Dubai, and it's sold as though it's a traditional Arabic souk. So that's my first question, what is Arabic? And then you'd find maybe like fezzes, tarbouches, but then you'd also find Moroccan-style kaftans. And then you'll find some things that are like, basically it's just vaguely Arab, vaguely Middle Eastern. And I just want to know, what do you make of that? Because when Kholood was saying how it's almost something that like excites us because it looks interesting. Like, myself as someone who's from, an Arab background, I'm Sudanese. You look at it and you say like, wow, this is so beautiful. Look at this representing us. But then also beneath it is something that's kind of like sinister. It's like, yeah, but we're not a monolith. Sorry, that was a lot of word vomit. But does that make sense? What do you make of that? And that just goes out to all of you.
Yeah, as you said, okay, but what wins at the end, okay? What makes the buyer buy it? Is it, okay, really the interpretation of, I don't know, the bad Orient or the stereotypical, okay, image? Or is the aesthetic and the interesting, details, the lovely colors and, the collage of a tarbouche from Egypt or, or jalabia from Maghreb. And, this is, okay, what really makes the buyer buy it at the end, right? It's not really the interpretation, but it's the beauty of the image, and that's it. I don't know if that answers, okay, your question.
are we, I guess, feeding into that whole idea that the Orient is just this like blurb of like sparkly things?
It's just a market, I believe. Even, you know, with Orientalist art, I'm always like in discussing this from the point, you know, that was, you know, Orientalist art was, okay, like, yeah, it was a kind of a trend for a specific, you know, period of time, because the market wanted those kind of scenes. So it's not because they are real scenes, okay, and people are buying them because they want to know what's the exotic and all of these things, like the unknown. But it's because it's a trend, okay, they make money out of it. So this is the imaginary thing, okay, what pleased the viewer. I think it's just the same thing, okay, the same practice, okay, is maintained until today, okay. We sell those ones because they are known, like, you know, these are Arab scenes. But it doesn't mean anything beyond that. I don't believe that it really, you know, it really indicates anything beyond that. You know what I mean? It's just a trend, okay, and a market, maybe, you know, like, مثل ما يقول متطلب، عرفتي يعني it's something for the market and that's it. Yeah. I was having also a conversation with one of the ladies, and she's, I think, from Spain, and she said, okay, for me, I never thought about it. And also, as well, okay, I participated in the debate, in Doha debate, with VCU, and all of the students who participated, they said, okay, something very interesting for me. So they said, okay, without you bringing to our attention that all of these, you know, like discussions, okay, discussion points about those works of art, we never, you know, thought about them. Even, you know, the movies, okay, we were talking about, you know, how those images and stereotypes were depicted, okay, in cinema and in other, in punk, you know, word, okay, and you know, even, you know, like the Korean thing, okay, now the Korean, okay, image. So all of these things, okay, we were just looking at them, okay, and watching them, okay, without even thinking about anything, okay, about, you know, the image between the East and West, all of this differentiation. It's just when you brought to us, to our attention, okay, about it, okay, in the debate, then we started to think and analyze everything that we watch, everything we listen to, you know what I mean? So I think, okay, even selling this kind of work, it doesn't really, we don't really sell our image, okay, and that, you know, like the bad image. It's just, okay, about, you know, this shop, okay, says these works, okay, you know, it's just the market, what people want, okay, when they come to this part of the, you know, of the world, they want to see these images in the market, in Souq Waqf, for example, and buy them, okay, yes, this is, okay, the East, but it's not the East, okay. I don't think they even go beyond that kind of idea.
Maybe we have space for another question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Vasiliki. I'm an art teacher. I would like to ask Professor Nadia, you mentioned a few times that there are contradictions in the work, in the paintings, the Orientalist paintings.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yes, you mentioned that there are some contradictions in the work, in the paintings. Could you elaborate a little bit more? What were you referring to? Is it the storytelling? Is it the narratives? What are the contradictions exactly for you?
Yes, thanks. I think there are actually multiple and multi-layered contradictions. One of them has been mentioned actually by both of you, by Kholood and Sara, is the sort of fabrication of a patchwork made of different sources, different references, but that gives the illusion of a whole which is homogeneous, and it's not at all, and which is truth, which gives this image of the Orient, which is maybe also, to respond to your question, yes, ahistorical, timeless, but it's there. And this is one of the, and I think one of the contradictions also, and it's also what makes the strength for me of the Orientalist, maybe Orientalist art, but also its discourse, is specifically the navigation between very scientific, minute details. Kholood was speaking about the tiles in the Jérôme work, which are studied, which refer to prints and grammar of ornaments or sketches taken on site, and then really pure fantasy and pure imaginary. But because there is this very fine line that's being navigated constantly, it makes the discourse and what those works say very strong. And it makes this truthful image very powerful. So I would say are some of the contradictions which come to make the strength of this imagery.
Maybe two more questions, and I think then.
So, with the basic schooling system rooted mostly in Western-centric, like it's a Western-centric system in almost all around the world. So, I want this answer from all three of you if possible. What was that certain point or core memory that you have where you actually wanted to follow Orientalism, or where you thought that, okay, this is what I want to explore? So it's more like a personal exploration question. So what was the core memory or the point or the transition? How was the transition in exploring into this?
Sorry, we have a little bit of trouble following your question. Could you speak up clearly, please?
Basically, for most of the schooling system, like I'm an Indian, so most of the schooling system is most Western-centric schooling system. So in order for somebody to follow Orientalism, you should be having roots, which all three of you have. So, but to completely follow it, there should be some starting point or some incidents or some core memories that you had as a starting point in completely following through as a path for your life.
I mean, your question is also about cultural memory as well.
Yes.
I mean, these are institutions, like for example, in India, where the British established, like the JJ Art College in New Delhi, which is a famous art school, or Baroda School of Art, for example. You know, they've subverted that curriculum. Although the British had played a really strong role in creating this sort of arts infrastructure, that is very different today. Although obviously there's an acknowledgement of that cultural memory, of that moment, of that historical legacy. There hasn't been sort of a severance completely, but new ideas and new sort of post-partition histories have sort of really impacted the art schools in India.
Yes, I just want to know personally, like, what was your turning point in life? Where you, like, a turning point in your life, a point from which you thought that Orientalism, or you wanted to start exploring Orientalism? Like, well, what was the major impact? I know the cultural impact is always there, sure, because only then you can identify the Oriental patterns, but otherwise...
I guess when I mentioned earlier about ideas around cultural interruptions, you know, like revolutions, ruptures, you know, for myself, I mean, my own work is somewhere sandwiched between 1979 and 9/11. And that's a really interesting period to sort of think about. You've got all those sort of revolutions that I mentioned earlier, and then you've got a stop that happens, you know, after the multicultural decade of the 90s, you get this absolute sort of shock when 9/11 happens. And then for me, in my own personal sort of art historical journey, my own curatorial journey, 9/11 plays that sort of really important role, because I just graduated and was doing my master's. So I went straight into my MA, and this big event happens, and it sort of shocks everything. So that was another sort of turning point in our understanding of Orientalism from a contemporary standpoint. So I hope that answers the question. Sorry, I had a trouble understanding your flow, excuse me.
It answers it perfectly. What about Professor Nadia?
Yeah, so I was Western educated, studying art history in an extremely conservative institute. And I actually I was interested in modernism that happened in Arab countries elsewhere, and notably in Egypt. And I did not fit in anywhere, I mean, not in this curriculum, and I wasn't satisfied with the way art history was presented from a very Western-centered perspective. And so I pushed through studying, modern artists working between the 20s and 50s in the Middle East, and specifically in Egypt. But basically, when you're not satisfied with what one is, giving you, then you go another way.
I think we have another question here as well. Sorry, over there.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. My name is Andrew, and my question is whether you are all rehabilitating Orientalist art. I mean, you talk about it in such polished and nuanced ways. Do you think that this obscures the fact that it was a tool of destruction for this region, and that maybe I'm confused by your affection for it? It must only be the aesthetics that you like, because to me it's detestable, the meaning that it carries. So can you help me understand whether your discussion today is an attempt to rehabilitate the genre?
Yeah, no, I think the point is not to rehabilitate. I mean, the point is not to caution. I think everyone here is very clear of the context in which those works have been produced, and everyone is quite clear with the fact that, of course, visual culture can be used as a means for domination, and especially in colonial contexts, right? Of course, there are stereotypes in Orientalism. I mean, gender, racial, I mean, it's all there. These are products of the 19th century. The 19th century is industrialization. It's the most racist, it's century of our history. So I think that this, for us, is very clear that it's all there. But also, one needs to nuance, I think, the reception of those artworks, because there is a very simplified binary of this opposition between East and West, and this eliminates all the actual interactions, the exchanges, and it's a Western discourse that speaks for the other. I mean, not all of the, let's say, those exchanges were in an extreme. I mean, it's also the fact of who speaks, who speaks for the others, who speaks for Orientalists. It's also a discourse that we can reappropriate ourselves from the Middle East. And I think this was really the point. It was not the point to say, oh, they're beautiful, they're great. I think, as I mentioned, some ambiguities. We can be attracted by the hyper-realism of a painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme and what is represented in it, and be very conscious of what it represents. But just saying, let's destroy them, I don't think it's...
No, what will we do in our
First,
museum?
There's no museum for Julia's. But it's not a solution. These are, as I said, art is not to make us comfortable. It's there to make us reflect, even if it's very uncomfortable, even if it's painful. That's my view.
And it's also maybe to challenge the one-sided image, and interpretation of those works of art. As we said before, for example, I was in one of the training courses, and there was an artist actually from this part of the world, and she was explaining about her work. And then when they finished, they said, Kholood, what do you think? I said, I have only one question for you. You are from the East, from the region, but why you're using the artwork, or you're using art, in order to perpetuate the same Western, image? Why don't you use it for something, like to see it from a different perspective, from an Eastern perspective, Why don't you challenge this kind of very common, perspective, or very common image? And then she said, Kholood, I don't have an answer now, but it might be just, as I was telling the girl here, it was just because she's following the market. But I thought, here we are in a context that we're discussing the power of art rather than just, and talking about art as a trend. It's just, we're here, we're believing in art, in this context of education and learning. So why don't you use the power of art, for something else, rather than just following, the market and the trends, to get money. So I think we are here all together, just to look at how how art is powerful, okay, and how we can challenge those kind of interpretations and perspectives, okay, and give it more space of freedom, okay, to see it differently. This is what I believe.
There's one special guest, and he has one question. That's okay.
My name is Roni Hello. So actually, my question is: when we look at today, what's happening, internationally, what's happening in our region, especially when it comes to politics, to war, to how we are portrayed in the media. For example, we look at. Let's talk about Arabs using social media to rectify their image, in the eyes of the Western world. For instance, what's happening in Gaza. What I want to know is, obviously, maybe we're talking in the 19th and 20th century, paintings and these artists were the media. This is how, this is the media that portrayed our image to the West. Was there like another movement that was born just an opposite, in parallel to the Orientalism, just to oppose that and to kind of counter-effect that? Was there a movement that was created, or not really? Like literally on the spot during, let's say, starting...
You mean Lebanese painters in Paris?
And later, early surrealism was sort of a global example. But you've mentioned something really interesting when you said social media. Because, if you think about someone like, not just Jerome, but any of these Orientalist painters, they're creating world building. They're doing AI, and if you've used AI, Real Engine, or any of these softwares to create an image, it gives you like an extra finger, or an extra, I don't know, sometimes even an extra limb. And it's really interesting because this is what AI does. When you feed it with certain images, sort of rather questions, and say, make a portrait of X, it creates this sort of odd thing with an extra finger. If you think about Orientalism, it also functioned on those same parameters. It was creating images of a world built artificially. Those people didn't live like that. They didn't exist like that. They were exact representations. And to go back to that gentleman's question, completely, Jerome is the poster boy on Edward Said's Orientalism. The snake charmer is that image. He has a very, very bad reputation when it comes to the precise remarks that you made regarding imperialism, colonialism, and so forth. But what's sort of really important is to think about this world-building concept. Like today, it's AI and all of this. Painters were sort of doing that in the 19th century too. That's the sort of roundabout way I can answer your question.
No, yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to know if there was like a counter movement that was created on the spot to, but yeah, this answers the question.
Sara mentioned surrealism.
Which came at the end.
Yeah, which could be considered a counter movement, but even before that, I think that it's just that we know less about modern, really modernism in the region, in the MENA region. But there were, as Julia mentioned, many Lebanese, Egyptians, Syrians, Iraqis who went to study in Paris, and they did already reflect on this notion of Orientalism, and they did.
Some adopted it, right?
Some
Osman
adopted,
Hamdi Bey.
Yes, some adopted them, but some also kind of subverted the Orientalist tropes.
That was much later, though. That wasn't like a one-to-one, parity. It was more in the 20th century that was sort of really head-on confronted by artists. The ones I had mentioned that were part of the movement that were looking at abstraction after the Ottoman Empire fell. And then if you think about the subsequent other histories that happened in the 20th century, that was when the sort of artists of that particular time, they were the ones that really addressed it head-on. Rather, those schools that the Ottomans established where Orientalist painters were working, they also included Arab colleagues and Turkish colleagues working in tandem with the European. So there were movements, obviously, that were happening at the same time. And obviously, maybe not just in visual art, but also in literature and poetry in particular. So you have to sort of look within the other mediums as well to help find that answer.
So I think I stop here now, right? Thank you so much for coming. And ladies, thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure talking to you. And please all come to the Lusail Museum in the future and the Jerome exhibition soon, and you know, get challenged.
Thank you. I would just like to thank you, Julia, and the panelists. And thank you very much again for coming today.